Hey guys, tonight we begin with the marbled chaos of ancient Rome, to the roaring crowds, sun-scorched stone, and sheer gladiatorial pageantry of the Colosseum. This wasn't just a stadium, it was a statement, a place where emperors flexed, lions roared, and half the audience missed the good parts because someone spilled wine on their tunic. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's game day in ancient Rome, and if you're a proper Roman citizen, that means one thing: you are not sleeping in. You wake before sunrise, probably thanks to a neighbour loudly arguing about whether it's too early to start drinking watered-down wine. You roll off your stone-hard mattress, stretch your stiff limbs, and mentally prepare yourself to spend the next 12 hours packed into a stone stadium with 50,000 of your closest strangers. Why the rush? Because if you're not out the door before dawn, you'll be stuck sitting behind a column next to a guy who brought live poultry, and you'll miss the best parts of the show, namely, everything that doesn't involve someone blocking your view with a giant feathered hat. The Colosseum may have 80 entrances, but that doesn't mean they're organised. You're funneled in with the other citizens in your seating category, which, based on your sandals and general level of grime, places you somewhere between barely respectable and technically allowed inside. Senators and patricians get marble benches and shade. You get stairs and whatever breeze happens to sneak through the arches. Along the way, you pass food vendors shouting about honey cakes, sausage skewers, and suspiciously warm olives. You consider grabbing breakfast, but you also don't want to be holding a fig when someone elbows you in the spleen. Priorities. By the time you reach your seat, if you can call a sun-bleached slab of stone a seat, you're already sweating. It's not even 7 a.m. You pull your tunic into some approximation of a cushion, nudge a child out of the way, and sit down. Around you, the stands are slowly filling up with other bleary-eyed citizens, chatting loudly about the rumours of the day. Are there really 20 tigers? Did a German gladiator bite someone's ear off? Is the emperor attending? And if so, will he be in a good mood? You don't know, but you're here. That's what matters. You made it into the Colosseum before the gates closed and the executions began. You haven't fainted, lost a sandal, or been trampled. Yet. By Roman standards, that's a perfect morning. As you finally get a moment to look around, the scale of the place hits you. The Colosseum is massive. Like, we could have built schools, but instead we did this, massive. Completed in 80 CE by Emperor Titus, the man who decided bread and circuses were a legitimate political strategy. The Colosseum wasn't just an amphitheatre. It was an architectural brag, a public relations stunt in stone. A way of saying, look at this empire, it's wide enough to import hippos for sport. At its peak, the Colosseum held somewhere between 50,000 to 80,000 people, depending on how loosely the fire marshal interpreted maximum capacity. It stood 150 feet high, had 4 levels of seating, and more entrances than a modern airport. It was so well designed that it could be filled in 15 minutes, or emptied in 10, if someone screamed fire or free wine. The exterior is clad in travertine limestone and decorated with grand arches, statues and columns. The kind of aesthetic overachievement you only get from an empire that's conquered everyone else's good ideas. Inside, it's a different story. You, the humble citizen, are sitting on bare stone under an open sky, while the senators below enjoy awnings, cushions, and a breeze generated by enslaved palm wavers. Above you is the velarium, a massive retractable awning operated by sailors, because apparently even the Navy was drafted into climate control. If it's a hot day, the velarium might be up. If not, you'll be squinting into the sun and slowly turning into a raisin. But the real marvel isn't the marble, it's the engineering beneath your feet. Beneath the arena floor lies a labyrinth of trapdoors, elevators, cages and pulleys. Animals, props, and sometimes very confused prisoners were launched into the arena like lethal surprises. One moment it's just sand. The next, it's 30 flaming chariots and an ostrich in a helmet. It's spectacle. It's strategy. It's an absolute flex. Rome didn't build the Colosseum to be practical. They built it to remind you, as you sweat in your fourth-tier seat, that the empire could kill you beautifully. Now that you're inside, sunburned, and emotionally prepared to sit for 8 hours, it's time to face the harshest truth of the Roman Colosseum. Your seat is a direct reflection of how little you matter. Seating wasn't general admission. It was an architectural caste system. Every tier, bench, and step was meticulously organized by social status, income, gender, and how often you dined with people who wore laurel wreaths for fun. Let's start at the bottom, or rather, the best. The podium level, closest to the action, was reserved for Rome's most powerful citizens: senators, magistrates, and priests. They had padded benches, the shade of the velarium, and the smug satisfaction of being able to see what was happening without squinting. Some even had their names carved into the marble. Permanent seating. Imagine being so important that your chair has tenure. Just above them were the equestrians, the Roman middle-upper class, or as we'd call them today, people with generational wealth and just enough modesty to pretend otherwise. Their seats weren't as plush, but they were still good enough to smell the lions. Then came the plebeians, Rome's working class. That's you. You're somewhere up in the third or fourth tier, balancing on a sun-bleached slab of stone, shoulder to shoulder, with a man yelling about bread prices and a woman breastfeeding while arguing with a vendor over the price of boiled snails. If you were a woman, and not a Vestal virgin, you were even higher up. Women, slaves, foreigners, and other undesirables got the nosebleeds. The views were bad, the shade was non-existent, and the smell of 50,000 Romans having feelings in wool tunics drifted upwards like an olfactory punishment. There were no cushions, no backrests, no cup holders. If you needed to pee, good luck finding your way back. And if someone spilled wine on you from above, that was just part of the ambience. But you came anyway, because the Colosseum wasn't just about the games. It was about being seen, even if all anyone saw was the top of your sweaty head. Welcome to the cheap seats. No one here is important, but everyone is entertained. So you've made it to your seat, high up, hot, and surrounded by people who believe personal hygiene is more of a seasonal suggestion than a daily habit. As you prepare for the festivities, your stomach growls. You didn't bring anything. Rookie mistake. Luckily, you're not out of options. The Colosseum had its own version of stadium vendors, only instead of peanuts, get your peanuts. It's more like olives, slightly fermented and suspiciously warm olives. The ancient Romans loved to snack. You could buy honey cakes, sausages, dates, figs, and, if you were feeling adventurous, garum-drenched nuts. Garum, for the uninitiated, was Rome's favourite fish sauce. It smelled like something you'd find in the bottom of a boat after 3 days of bad decisions. Romans loved it. You'd love it too, if your only other condiment was crushed goat liver. Vendors wandered up and down the steps, shouting their wares over the roar of the crowd. The man behind you is loudly arguing with one over the price of vinegared wine. It's watered down, but still effective, particularly when you haven't eaten since yesterday and the midday sun is actively trying to kill you. Then there are the smells, not just the food, though the blend of roasted meat and cheap perfume is doing its best to clog your sinuses, but also the crowd. The Colosseum, for all its glory, was a public bath's evil twin. No flowing water, no fresh air, just sun-baked humanity in tunics. To your left, a man fans himself with a scroll. To your right, someone brought a goat, not for food, for company. In front of you, a child is chewing something that used to be bread and now resembles stone. And somehow, above it all, floats the unmistakable scent of sweat, sand, and slowly wilting dignity. Still, there's an odd charm to it. The vendors are part of the theatre. They know when to quiet down, when to yell, and how to dodge a vomit stain on the stairs like seasoned professionals. You didn't come for the snacks, but now you can't imagine surviving without them, especially once the games start. You'll want something to chew on and emotionally process while watching a man try to fight a leopard with a fork. The games always started with a bang, or more accurately, a beheading. Before the gladiators took the stage, the Colosseum warmed up the crowd with a little morning bloodletting, courtesy of condemned criminals, war prisoners, and people who probably just annoyed the wrong senator. These weren't your standard boring executions either. No, this was Rome. This was entertainment. The condemned were often forced to reenact famous myths, but with the kind of realism that would make modern directors say, "Hey, maybe tone it down." Take the story of Prometheus, for instance. In the myth, he's chained to a rock while an eagle eats his liver every day. In the Colosseum version, a criminal is chained to a fake rock, and a real eagle is encouraged to dig in. Not symbolic violence, actual organ removal. Another crowd favourite was Orpheus in the underworld. It ended, predictably, with Orpheus being torn apart by wild animals. And yes, actual leopards were involved. You're starting to realise that when Romans said live theatre, they meant it very, very literally. The audience loved this part, cheering, laughing, booing like it was a bad comedy set. The logic was simple. These people were criminals, and public execution was a civic duty, and a public service all rolled into one. It was justice, wrapped in spectacle, dipped in horror, and served before lunch. Sometimes the condemned were simply thrown to the beasts with no backstory or dramatic flair, just man versus lion, minus the inspirational music. These moments were loud, fast, and, if you blinked, over. The crowd loved the unpredictability. The man next to you is already yelling, "Bite the leg," and it's 8:30 in the morning. It's hard to say what's more shocking, the violence or how completely normal it feels here. This isn't considered extreme, this is just the warm-up. And as the final body is dragged off stage and the arena is raked smooth again, you find yourself clapping. Not because you're bloodthirsty, but because everyone else is clapping and you don't want to seem like the weird one. Congratulations. You're now emotionally invested, and the real show hasn't even started. After the criminals have been properly mythologized and dismembered, it's time for round 2 of the morning spectacle, the beast hunts, or venaciones, for those of you who like your Latin with a side of animal cruelty. Now, if you thought this part was going to be a calm interlude between gore and glory, think again. Rome didn't conquer half the world just to import silk and spices. No, they brought back everything with teeth. Lions from North Africa, elephants from India, bears from Gaul, ostriches from wherever ostriches came from before they regretted it. The arena floor transforms. Trees, fake rocks and scenery rise dramatically from hidden trapdoors, because why just butcher an animal when you can give it a theme? Then out comes the hunter, a venator. Not a gladiator, mind you. This guy has fewer muscles, more decorative feathers, and probably a deep sense of regret. His job is to show off, maybe fire an arrow or two, and dramatically dodge whatever angry carnivore bursts from the tunnel. Cue. A lion that hasn't eaten in 2 days. The crowd is thrilled. Bets are placed. Someone behind you is already shouting, 2 sesterces on the lion. And the woman next to him is trying to sell fig pastries shaped like leopards. Capitalism lives. Sometimes it's one-on-one, hunter versus beast. Other times it's mass chaos. A dozen panthers released at once while archers on platforms try not to shoot each other. On special occasions, elephants are brought in. You haven't truly experienced ancient Rome until you've seen an elephant stomp on a wooden replica of a barbarian village, while an official explains how this represents Rome's triumph over uncivilized lands. It's equal parts nationalistic pageant and animal-themed panic attack. And if you're wondering whether the animals ever won, yes. Yes, they did. Sometimes the hunters didn't walk out, and the crowd loved that too. There's something deeply Roman about cheering both the hunter and the thing trying to eat him. Eventually the beasts are killed, the scenery is cleared, and someone with a broom and a very high tolerance for trauma comes out to clean up what's left of the morning. You take a deep breath, because up next, actual humans fighting each other for your entertainment. The crowd hushes, trumpets blare. Somewhere, a nervous goat bleats. It's finally time for what everyone's been waiting for. The gladiators. Forget the criminals and the leopards. This is the main event. The part where trained professionals try to turn each other into decorative stains on sand. If the beast hunts were breakfast, this is the roasted meat platter of the day, served with a side of existential crisis. Gladiators weren't just fighters, they were celebrities. Think modern athletes, but with more scars and less dental coverage. Some were slaves, some were volunteers, some were nobles going through a phase. All of them knew how to make an entrance. And what an entrance it is. They emerge from the darkened tunnels like rock stars, or maybe like livestock who've learned choreography. Their armour gleams in the sun, helmets sparkle, swords are drawn, the crowd erupts, children scream, someone throws a garland. You're not even sure who these guys are, but you cheer anyway because peer pressure is eternal. The announcer, yes there is one, calls out the names, origins and combat styles of each gladiator. A retiarius with a net and trident, a secutor with a smooth helmet and a short sword, a murmillo with a fish-shaped crest that's not helping him win any fashion contests. Each pairing is carefully chosen for drama, big versus small, fast versus armoured, local hero versus imported lunatic. This is a blood sport with casting direction. Then the fight begins. It's not just wild swinging. There's strategy, rhythm, pauses, feints, parrying, sand, lots of sand. Some fights end quickly. One bad step, one good stab. Others drag on for minutes as the fighters circle each other like angry ballet dancers with iron shoes. The crowd lives for it, gasping, cheering, shouting unsolicited advice from the upper tiers. Go for the neck! Use the net! Stop tripping on your own shield, Gaius! You're on the edge of your very uncomfortable stone seat, because even from up here you can feel the tension. This isn't some abstract performance. These men are fighting for survival, for fame, for a chance at not dying today. And the best part, it's still only midday. As you settle in for another round of organised mayhem, you begin to notice something. Not all gladiators look the same. That's because Rome didn't just want fighting, it wanted categories, themes, and stylistic bloodshed. This is less a brawl and more a very violent fashion show. Each gladiator type had their own distinct look, fighting style, and probability of getting impaled. Let's start with the retiarius. Light armour, no helmet, armed with a net and trident. Basically a fisherman with anger issues. They're fast, nimble, and often pantsless, which adds an extra layer of vulnerability and breeze. Then there's the secutor, their natural enemy. Secutors wear smooth, close-fitting helmets, supposedly to keep the net from catching, and carry short swords. Think of them as anti-fishermen. Their job is to run at the guy with the net and hope no one brought slippery sandals. The murmillo is the tank. Big shield, big helmet, big everything. They're slow but durable, kind of like an armoured ox that took fencing lessons. Their helmets often have fish motifs, which is ironic when they're fighting a guy with a trident. Thracians, Hoplomachuses, Dimocaeri, each with their own mix of swords, spears, daggers, and reckless bravado. Some wear greaves and arm guards. Others look like they lost a bet with a blacksmith, but all of them fight with flair. This wasn't just about winning. It was about putting on a show. The audience had favourites, not always the best fighters, but the most dramatic, the ones who posed, roared, or shouted catchy one-liners before lunging. One guy even saluted the emperor with a spin move. He died 5 minutes later, but boy, did he make an entrance. The weapons were real. The blood was real. The applause, also real, and loud. Sometimes you'd swear the guy next to you was going to throw his sandals in the arena out of excitement. And yet, there's something oddly elegant about it all. Technique mattered. Footwork mattered. If you were lucky enough to live past your first few matches, you learned how to fight smart, or at least stylishly. Because in the Colosseum, dying was expected. Dying with bad form. Now that was unforgivable. So the fight is over. One gladiator's standing, sweaty and breathing hard. The other's on the ground, bleeding, maybe twitching, and definitely rethinking his career choices. What happens now? Well, that depends on the mood of one man. The Emperor. Yes, the most powerful figure in the known world. The guy with a literal laurel wreath on his head and his own food taster. Now gets to play casual death god. The surviving gladiator looks up. The crowd roars, but the final call isn't theirs. It's His Imperial Majesty, seated comfortably in the best spot in the house, under an awning, sipping wine that probably costs more than your rent. Now, you've heard the stories. Thumbs up means mercy, thumbs down means death. But, like most things from ancient Rome, it's more complicated and more vague. Some historians think it was the reverse. Others think the emperor just waved his hand vaguely and hoped people guessed correctly. Regardless, the wounded man is looking up at the royal box with the desperation of someone who's realised that being popular was actually very, very important. If the emperor is feeling generous, or if the downed gladiator gave a particularly good show, he might be spared. The crowd might chant, "Mite!" Let him go. If he was boring, clumsy, or worst of all, a foreigner who didn't smile enough, the crowd chants, "Ugula!" Kill him. And the emperor, he might listen, or he might shrug and signal doom while reaching for a honey cake. Sometimes the crowd sways the verdict. Other times the emperor uses it as a political stunt, a chance to look merciful in front of the plebs or brutally decisive in front of senators. It's public relations through bloodshed, and if death is ordered, the victor steps forward and delivers the final blow. Clean, swift, theatrical. Or, if he's feeling spiteful, dramatic and messy. Either way, the loser dies with a bit of dignity and a lot of sand in his mouth. The crowd applauds. A flute player strikes up something cheerful. Slaves come to drag the body away and rake the arena smooth. And then, on to the next match, because nothing keeps the empire running like a tight schedule and a loose definition of mercy. The sun is now directly overhead. The marble is hot enough to fry a dormouse, and the guy next to you is slowly melting into his tunic. You, however, are still seated, because you've made it this far, and damn it, you are going to watch men hit each other with swords even if you pass out doing it. Welcome to intermission, or as the Romans saw it, an opportunity to not die from dehydration before the next round of Mortal Kombat. There's no scheduled halftime show, no gladiators doing synchronized routines to pan flute music, just a lull in the screaming, some polite groaning, and the distinct sound of thousands of people shifting their sweaty bodies on stone. Vendors reappear, somehow louder than before. Wine, olives, salted something. You buy a cup of lukewarm posca, a vinegar water concoction so tart it could pickle your internal organs, because it's either that or licking condensation off a senator's awning. Meanwhile, slaves rake the arena floor, smoothing out the sand and scooping up any leftover limbs the morning crew missed. The smell. Somewhere between petting zoo, gym locker, and open grave. You try not to breathe too deeply. People use this time to socialise. Senators stretch. Nobles whisper about which gladiator had the best abs. You overhear one man explaining to his wife that the lion clearly deserved to win. She's nodding while fanning herself with a wax tablet. Up in the cheap seats, a man faints. No one moves. Not out of malice. It's just that everyone else is one faint away from joining him. If you're lucky, the velarium, that massive canvas awning, is extended today. Operated by sailors, because naturally rigging a sunshade requires maritime training, it provides patchy relief from the heat. If you're in its shadow, congratulations. If not, enjoy watching your shadow slowly crisp like an amphora left in an oven. Eventually a trumpet sounds. The crowd stirs. The guy who fainted is awake again, possibly by force. The games resume. You're parched, sunburnt, and halfway to delirious, and somehow you still wouldn't leave early, because in the Roman Colosseum, you didn't just watch history, you sweated directly into it. Just when you think you've seen everything, lions, leopards, blood-soaked gladiators, and a man fainting face first into a sausage tray, Rome hits you with something even more absurd. A naval battle. Yes, inside the Colosseum. No, you're not hallucinating. Though that vinegar wine is doing strange things. This wasn't every day, mind you. Flooding the arena was expensive, dramatic, and logistically chaotic, which made it absolutely perfect for Rome. It showed off not just military might, but engineering arrogance of the highest order. Why not turn a building into a lake, they thought. We have slaves for that. To pull it off, the arena's floor was removed, or hadn't been built yet, early in the Colosseum's career. Then a complex system of aqueducts and drains would flood the space with water. Real water, deep enough for small warships. You watch, astonished, as soldiers dressed like ancient Greeks row tiny triremes into the middle of what used to be the sandpit where you saw a bear disembowel a guy 40 minutes ago. The battles themselves? Less naval strategy, more chaotic splashing with costumes. Ships collided, men jumped from deck to deck, archers fired, sometimes boats caught fire, intentionally for flair. If you weren't impressed, you might be a corpse. Even the jaded senators raised an eyebrow when a miniature pirate ship exploded. Of course, the participants weren't career sailors. They were condemned men, often criminals, prisoners of war, or just people who fell behind on taxes at the wrong time. Their job was to die theatrically in a puddle that smelled vaguely of donkey sweat and fish sauce. Still, the crowd went wild. This was storytelling on steroids. Mythological reenactments, famous sea battles, all performed live, with props, special effects, and a suspiciously high casualty rate. Think historical reenactment meets live-action drowning. When it was all over, the water was drained. Quickly, somehow. Probably by people whose job titles were simply, "Don't ask." You sit in awe, wondering how you'll ever return to watching street musicians or mimes after this. You've just witnessed an indoor war at sea, and they're not even done. Because after naval combat, it's time for the grand finale. The sun begins to dip, the shadows stretch across the arena sand, and the scent of crushed olives, sweat, and existential dread lingers thick in the air. You've watched men fight beasts, boats sink in a surprise lake, and more blood than you expected to see in one sitting. Logically, this would be the time to go home, take a sponge bath, and question your life choices. But no, this is Rome, which means it's time for the grand finale. A final, carefully choreographed orgy of violence and theatre designed to leave the crowd staggering home in either awe or nausea. Sometimes this meant massive group battles. Dozens of gladiators released at once, charging each other in carefully planned chaos. Shields clanged, swords flew, sand kicked up like someone dropped a bag of flour into a wind tunnel. It wasn't subtle, but then again, neither is anything Rome does. Other times they ended with a spectacle so outrageous it defied reason. Think, a gladiator team versus elephants wearing armour, or a duel staged to recreate a legendary myth where both men have rehearsed their deaths for weeks, and then one of them accidentally wins for real. This is where the showmanship peaks. Dying men still try to pose. Survivors scream to the heavens. The crowd, on their feet, a sea of tunics, fists, and enthusiastic moral flexibility. People chant for their favourites. Garlands are thrown. If a gladiator survives the day and has really impressed the crowd, he might even be awarded a wooden sword, the Rudi's, and his freedom. It's rare, but when it happens, everyone cries. Even the wine vendors. The emperor stands, nods, waves, or does something appropriately majestic. Maybe he leaves early, bored. Maybe he makes a speech. Either way, the day ends not with a whimper, but with thunderous applause and the distant sound of someone vomiting from too much sun and garum. You, exhausted and deeply confused about your ethics, rise with the others. Your tunic is stained, your back is numb, and your mind is filled with scenes you'll never quite be able to explain at dinner. And yet, you'd absolutely come again tomorrow, because no one stages a blood-soaked standing ovation quite like Rome. The trumpets have faded, the last gladiator has limped off stage, possibly upright, possibly being carried like a tragic meat sack. The crowd begins to stir, stretch, and engage in that most timeless of Roman traditions, judging everyone else's opinions out loud. As you make your way toward the exit, or try to, it's basically a tunic-based traffic jam. The post-show buzz kicks in. Everyone suddenly becomes a gladiatorial expert, despite having spent most of the fight arguing with their cousin about fermented goat cheese. I told you the Thracian was going to win. No, the Secutor was robbed. Total sabotage. That elephant didn't even try. Clearly sick. Meanwhile, the vendors haven't missed a beat. They're still selling watered wine and mystery meats with the same enthusiasm they had 8 hours ago. Nothing pairs better with dramatic trauma than a warm skewer of questionable protein. The streets outside the Colosseum are a medieval music festival meets garbage fire. The city didn't really have a sanitation department, unless you count stray dogs and disgruntled slaves. Discarded laurel wreaths, broken amphorae, food wrappers made from leaves, all blending into what scholars would later call archaeological evidence. Children reenact their favourite kills with sticks and alarming accuracy. Drunken spectators stagger home, proudly retelling the time a lion made eye contact with them. Someone starts singing. No one knows the words. No one cares. If a gladiator survived the day and was particularly popular, his name will spread through the streets before sunset. He might even get a dinner invite from a senator, or, more importantly, a bath. People will write crude graffiti in his honour. Marcus, Slayer of 5, hot. If he died? Well, he might get a funeral. Maybe. Depends on the budget. And you? You're exhausted, covered in a thin layer of sand and regret, and your calves feel like they've been kicked by a centurion. But your heart is pounding, and your brain is still buzzing with every scream, cheer, and trumpet blast. The games are over. For today. But the stories, the arguments, the glory, those will echo through Rome until the next time the Colosseum gates creak open, which conveniently is probably next week. By now you may be wondering, just how much did all this cost? The animals, the armour, the scenery, the wine that tasted like regret. None of it came cheap. Welcome to the economics of Roman entertainment, a financial sinkhole so massive, it probably made accountants weep into their togas. Let's start with the Colosseum itself. Built under Emperor Vespasian and finished by his son Titus, this stone behemoth took over a decade, thousands of labourers, and an ungodly amount of concrete to complete. It could seat upwards of 50,000 people, none of whom paid for tickets. That's right. Entry was free, which is a lovely way to build goodwill and a terrible business model. So, how did they fund this blood-soaked variety show? Answer: conquest money. The Colosseum was famously financed by the spoils of the Jewish war, specifically the looting of Jerusalem, which means every trident and tuna-stuffed date was indirectly sponsored by imperial plunder. Think of it as Rome's version of a military-industrial complex, with more flaming leopards. And then there were the games. A single festival could last 100 days, featuring thousands of gladiators and animals. Feeding, housing, and transporting elephants from Carthage or hippos from the Nile wasn't exactly cheap. There's no economy class for rhinos, and they tend to destroy the luggage rack. Even the gladiators came at a cost. Training, armour, medical care. Yes, they had doctors, surprisingly good ones. And of course, burials for the less fortunate. All of it fell on the shoulders of emperors, magistrates, and wealthy sponsors, hoping to gain political points or just avoid being the next contestant in the arena. Estimates suggest that some of the larger festivals could bankrupt a lesser noble. But hey, if it kept the mob happy, it was worth it. After all, a content citizen was less likely to riot, and more likely to chant your name while you handed out cheap wine. The phrase panem et circenses, bread and circuses, wasn't just philosophy, it was statecraft. Distract the people with carbs and carnage, and you could get away with just about anything. Except, of course, running out of money. That's when the trouble really started. So you've survived a full day in the Colosseum. You've witnessed executions, beast hunts, shipwrecks, sword fights, sunstroke, questionable sausages, and an entire empire's fragile ego on display. And the real mystery isn't how anyone survived the heat. It's why they came back. The answer is simple. Rome knew how to put on a show. For the average Roman citizen, especially those in the lower classes, life outside the arena was, well, let's say, unforgiving. Cramped apartments, uncertain food supplies, public toilets that doubled as conversational spaces, and a city that smelled like ambition, sewage, and goat. But for a few glorious hours, the Colosseum offered escape. Inside those towering stone walls, you weren't a shoemaker with back pain or a slave with terrible luck. You were a spectator, a part of something larger, a witness to triumph, tragedy, and highly choreographed maulings. It was also where Rome told its story, not with books or lectures, but with spectacle. Each fight symbolized the strength of the empire, the order of Roman civilization triumphing over chaos, or at least some guy named Chaos getting decapitated. And let's be honest, humans have always had a complicated relationship with violence. The Colosseum just industrialized it. Where else could you eat a fig tart while watching a Macedonian duel a Gaul under flaming javelins? There was also social pressure. Everyone went. Senators, merchants, beggars, gossiping widows. To skip the games was to miss the thing everyone else would be talking about. You'd be the person at the dinner party going, "Wait, they had ostriches today?" And suddenly no one wants to sit next to you. And finally, let's not forget the simplest reason. It was free. You could complain about the noise, the blood, and the flaming boats, but your wallet remained blissfully untouched. Rome might be an empire built on conquest and taxes, but it knew how to buy loyalty with deadpan pageantry. So the people kept coming back. For the thrill, for the story, for the chance to forget, just for a moment, that outside the arena they were at the mercy of senators and sewer rats. Inside, they were spectators, and in Rome, that was the closest most people ever got to power. Imagine a medieval town before the rise of guilds. The year is 1100. The air stinks of smoke, sweat, and horse dung. Narrow streets wind through cramped wooden houses, and behind every rickety stall someone is trying to sell you something. A shoe, a pot, a hunk of bread, all of wildly different quality. You need new boots. The first cobbler says he trained under a master in Paris. The second says he trained under the moon and stars. Their shoes look the same at a glance, but one falls apart in the rain, and the other gives you blisters so bad they'd get their own death certificate. This was the medieval economy before regulation, a chaotic buyer-beware world of guesswork and salesmanship. Artisans were mostly on their own. There were no standard training paths, no oversight, and no organisation protecting the interests of workers or customers. Anyone with tools and a prayer could claim to be a craftsman. Some of them were geniuses. Most of them were, let's say, experimental. If you were an apprentice, good luck. Maybe you were lucky enough to learn under a skilled blacksmith who didn't drink molten iron. Or maybe your master used you as a glorified bellows and taught you nothing useful except how to avoid being hit with a hammer. Your career success depended almost entirely on who you managed to beg, bribe, or flatter into training you, and forget fair wages. Since there were no collective bargaining rights, employers could pay workers whatever they wanted, usually the bare minimum unless you had connections or muscle. Customers weren't safe either. Bread might be filled with sawdust. Pottery might crack before you got home. Tailors could cut you a doublet so misshapen it looked like it had been made for a goat with scoliosis. Quality and honesty were optional, not required. There was a growing sense of dissatisfaction. Towns were expanding, trade was increasing. The risks of shoddy craftsmanship and dishonest dealers became more than just local annoyances. They threatened economic stability. And out of that chaos, a solution began to form. One that would reshape not only work, but entire cities. They called it the Guild. So how did the guilds begin? Slowly, quietly, out of necessity, like all great systems. In towns across Europe, skilled artisans and tradesmen began to meet in taverns, churches, and even under trees in the village square. They were bakers, smiths, tailors, carpenters, men and women whose livelihoods were being undercut by frauds, cheats, and hacks. They didn't call it a guild at first, just a gathering of those who actually knew what they were doing. At first, it was about protecting their name. If someone sold a warped sword and called themselves a smith, that reflected badly on all smiths. So they started setting rules. Don't undercut prices, don't use cheap materials, don't train fools. It wasn't long before these little circles formalized. They gave themselves names, codes of conduct, and, crucially, control. If you wanted to work in their town as a mason, for example, you had to go through them. No approval, no customers, no job. These early guilds were part labour union, part trade school, and part secret society. And yes, there were candles, chants, and weird initiation rituals, because this was medieval Europe, and everything had candles and weird initiation rituals. Guilds didn't just form in big cities. Even small towns had their own local weavers' guild, or coopers' guild. They worked together to regulate quality, enforce fair wages, and maintain ethical standards. If you sold bread with ground-up bones in it, yes, people did that. The Bakers' Guild would fine you, shame you, and possibly throw you out. Good luck making a living after that. For the common worker, this was a lifeline. Suddenly there was a path forward. If you were poor but skilled, a guild could help you rise. You'd start as an apprentice, train under a master, and eventually submit your masterpiece, a literal test project, to prove your worth. If accepted, you joined the ranks of the professionals. The towns liked this too. Guilds meant better products, less fraud, and a stronger economy, and they could be taxed. Let's not forget that part. No system spreads without someone getting paid. By the 12th century, guilds weren't just common. They were powerful. They set prices, controlled markets, and in some towns had more influence than the mayor. And if you dared go against them, well, that's where things got serious. Joining a guild wasn't as simple as raising your hand and saying, "I make shoes now." No. Guilds were gatekeepers of tradition, skill, and, let's be honest, money. And they had rules. Lots of them. First, you started at the very bottom, an apprentice. Usually a boy around 12 or 13, though girls could apprentice too in trades like weaving or baking. You'd be sent off to live with a master, not just to learn the craft, but to be raised in the trade. It was part job, part adoption, part medieval boot camp. You'd clean the forge, run errands, stir the dye vats, and maybe, just maybe, be allowed to touch actual tools after a year or two. You were paid nothing. In fact, your family often paid the master to take you. And the training? Grueling. If you survived the years of labour and didn't accidentally kill yourself with a misplaced chisel, you could graduate to the next level. Journeyman. Now you were mobile. You could travel, hence the name, from town to town, working for various masters, perfecting your craft, and getting paid a wage. But you still weren't a full member. That title was reserved for those who submitted a masterpiece, a finished product so flawless it would be judged by the guild elders themselves. Imagine the pressure. You spend months crafting a single item, a chair, a sword, a tapestry, knowing that a crooked stitch or uneven weld could send you back to journeyman status. If you passed, congratulations. You were now a master, with the right to open your own shop, train apprentices, and have a say in guild politics. But being a master didn't mean freedom. You were now beholden to the guild's book of rules, and oh boy, was it thick. You couldn't work outside guild hours. You couldn't undercut the agreed-upon price. You couldn't hire too many workers or use unapproved materials. Violations meant fines, blacklisting, or worse, public humiliation. And yes, there were official punishments for shoddy work, up to and including being banned from the town. Every guild also had its own rituals, symbols, and oaths. Some had patron saints. Some had guild halls grander than churches. It was part club, part cartel, part medieval mafia. And now that they had power, guilds weren't afraid to use it, not just to protect their trade, but to shape entire cities. By the 13th century, guilds weren't just part of town life. They were town life. Walk through a bustling medieval city like Bruges, Ghent, or London, and you'd see their influence everywhere. Streets were often named after trades: Baker Street, Fishmonger's Lane, Cordwainer's Alley. The finest buildings? Not palaces, guild halls. These were towering stone structures that served as meeting places, event venues, courts, and yes, occasionally taverns after hours. Guilds dictated not only what got made, but how, when, and by whom. They regulated prices to prevent undercutting, set minimum standards for quality, and even determined how many workers a master could employ. The goal wasn't just competition, it was control, stability, predictability. A guild town was an organised town. City governments knew better than to challenge guilds. In fact, most mayors and councilmen were guild members themselves. You couldn't rise to power without guild backing. Elections? Those were often decided behind closed doors in guild halls, not in public squares. Some guilds even kept private armies of armed men to protect their members and negotiate with the authorities if taxes got too high. Guilds also acted as social safety nets. If you got sick or injured, your guild helped pay your bills. If your house burned down, they sent aid. If you died, they paid for your funeral and made sure your widow and kids didn't starve. In a world without insurance, social security, or labour laws, the guild was your lifeline. And let's not forget the guild festivals. Each trade had a patron saint. Bakers had Saint Honoré, blacksmiths had Saint Eligius, and everyone had a reason to throw a parade. These festivals featured processions, pageants, feasting, and generous quantities of whatever booze was appropriate for the trade. Sometimes they even had competitive games. Imagine a tug of war between butchers and tailors, and you'll get the vibe. Of course, guilds didn't always play nicely with each other. Tensions often flared between different trades, especially when overlapping duties created turf wars. Should a cobbler or a tanner be allowed to make riding boots? Should a carpenter be allowed to repair a ship? These disagreements could lead to lawsuits or fists. Still, guilds brought order to chaos. They turned towns into engines of commerce, skill, and civic pride. But as their influence grew, so did their arrogance and their enemies. For all their benefits, medieval guilds were not warm, inclusive havens of brotherhood. They were exclusive, elitist, and, once they got a taste of real power, deeply corrupt. Want to join a guild as a master? Good luck if you weren't the son of a master, or didn't have the right connections. The masterpiece you submitted? It didn't matter how flawless it was if the elders just didn't like your face, your family, or your newfangled ideas. In many towns, guilds turned into hereditary clubs, where bloodlines mattered more than skill. If you were an outsider, a newcomer to the town, an ethnic minority, or simply poor, the doors were closed, permanently. You could toil as a journeyman your entire life and still never be allowed to set up your own shop. The guild would just keep raising the bar. This rug isn't symmetrical. This sword is too sharp. This loaf of bread doesn't have enough soul. They had 100 ways to say no. And if you tried to work without guild approval, they'd shut you down, literally. Guild enforcers, and yes, that was a real thing, would smash your goods, drive out your customers, or fine you into poverty. In extreme cases, rogue craftsmen could be publicly flogged, imprisoned, or exiled. The guilds called it protecting standards. Critics called it a monopoly. Guild masters also played dirty with politics. Many bribed officials to maintain their privileges, dodged taxes, or bullied rival guilds out of influence. Blacksmiths might sabotage carpenters, brewers might rat out bakers, and tailors might rig a vote to secure city contracts. These weren't just craftsmen. They were kingmakers. And then there were the women. In theory, some guilds allowed women, especially in textiles, brewing, and food preparation. But in practice, women were often relegated to the sidelines. Widows of masters could take over shops, but rarely gained full membership. Even when they ran successful businesses, guilds frequently ignored, excluded, or outright erased them from records. Power belonged to men, and even skilled women had to fight tooth and nail for recognition. Guilds had started as protectors of quality and fairness, but by the 14th century, many had become self-serving gatekeepers, rich, rigid, and resistant to change. And that rigidity would be their greatest weakness in the centuries to come. Despite their flaws, one thing guilds did exceptionally well was education, or rather, vocational domination. In a time when universities were reserved for theologians, lawyers, and the occasional monk with a good memory, guilds handled the real-world stuff: how to make boots, build bridges, brew beer, and not die while doing it. Training wasn't casual. It was a years-long, structured, often grueling process. An apprentice's life revolved around two things: the workshop and the master's temper. From dawn till dusk, they watched, repeated, and slowly earned the right to do more than just sweep the floor or pump bellows. The master wasn't just a boss. He was a teacher, parent, disciplinarian, and, depending on your perspective, a tyrant with a hammer. Discipline was strict, expectations were high, and mistakes were rarely tolerated. Burn a batch of wool? That's a week's wages gone. Drop a chisel on your foot, clean up the blood and get back to work. Yet for all the hardship, this was the golden ladder. An ambitious apprentice could over time become a journeyman, travel the realm to gain experience, and eventually, if the stars aligned, produce their masterpiece and rise to master rank. It was the closest thing the medieval world had to social mobility. Journeymen also had their own subculture. These weren't just workers. They were adventurers with tool belts. A young carpenter might travel from Cologne to Venice, learning new techniques and styles, gathering letters of recommendation, and swapping stories in smoky taverns. In some regions like Germany, these journeys became formalized traditions called the Wanderschaft, requiring years of travel and strict codes of conduct. But here's where the guilds got clever. They created a closed knowledge loop. Only members had access to certain tools, formulas, or techniques. Recipes for dyes, brewing ratios, forge temperatures, all were guarded secrets. If you wanted to learn the trade, you had to play by guild rules. No backdoor tutorials, no online forums. Just a dusty master with a scar on his cheek and a lot of opinions. The guild system made sure that skill stayed in the family, the guild family. It created generations of competent, loyal craftsmen. But it also meant outsiders stayed outsiders. Still, for those lucky enough to get in, the guild was the ultimate school of hard knocks, with lifetime job security at the end of the tunnel. To truly understand the medieval guild, you have to stop thinking of it as just a labour union or economic machine. It was more than that. It was a culture, a way of life. If you were part of a guild, it didn't just affect your workday. It shaped how you saw yourself, how you worshipped, who you married, and how people judged your worth. Guilds had their own patron saints, coats of arms, ceremonial robes, flags, and even mascots. Bakers might wear white linen and march behind a golden loaf on a stick during parades. Butchers might carry cleavers wrapped in ribbons. These weren't just parades. They were public displays of pride, hierarchy, and wealth. You knew who the top masters were by their velvet cloaks and fur-lined collars. You also knew which guild was doing very well that year by the size of the ox they roasted in the square. Membership meant status. Even the lowest-ranked journeyman in a respected guild could hold his head higher than an independent peasant with no protection. Masters were often among the richest men in town, and their daughters were considered prime marriage material. If you wanted to rise socially, marrying into a guild family was one way to do it. But it wasn't all pomp and glory. Guilds also fostered a sense of brotherhood, or in some cases, sisterhood. Members were expected to look after one another. If a guild member died, others would ensure his funeral was paid for and his children had clothing. If someone fell ill or had their tools stolen, the guild might raise money for replacements. It was a tight-knit community bound by oaths and shared experience, and sometimes beer. The guild calendar also shaped the rhythm of the year. There were feast days, saint days, guild anniversaries, and holy obligations. Members were expected to attend mass together, contribute to charitable works, and celebrate their trade's significance with pride. It gave structure to a world otherwise ruled by uncertainty, war, plague, famine, and reminded craftsmen that their labour had divine approval. In a society where identity was everything, being a guild member told the world who you were. Not just your profession, but your place in the grand medieval order. But as Europe began to change, the world started asking, could that order survive? For centuries, guilds had ruled the streets, economic titans in velvet cloaks. But by the late 15th and 16th centuries, cracks began to appear in their stone-solid foundations. The medieval world was changing fast, and the guilds, once engines of innovation, suddenly looked more like relics. First came the population boom. Cities expanded, trade exploded, new towns emerged overnight. The guilds, built for small communities, struggled to control a world spinning faster than they could regulate. Their carefully crafted rules couldn't keep up with the flood of new workers, new goods, and, worst of all, new ideas. Then came the merchants. While guilds made things, merchants moved them, and they didn't care about tradition. They cared about profit. They formed their own powerful associations, merchant leagues, shipping cartels, banking dynasties. Unlike craft guilds, these groups didn't care whether your thread was spun by hand or powered by a water wheel. Efficiency trumped purity. The Renaissance didn't help either. Suddenly, thinkers and reformers were questioning everything. Religion, monarchy, even the old trade hierarchies. Critics called guilds stiflers of progress, too rigid, too protective, too obsessed with secrets. Inventions like the printing press spread new techniques far and wide, bypassing guild approval entirely. But the biggest blow came from capitalism. As Europe moved toward market-based economies, entrepreneurs started opening workshops outside guild control. They hired dozens of unskilled labourers to mass-produce goods at lower prices. No masterpiece required. This early form of industrialization made the old apprentice-journeyman master ladder look painfully slow. And as monarchs centralized power, they began breaking guild monopolies. Kings and queens wanted direct control over trade and taxes. Guilds were in the way. Charters were revoked, rules rewritten, privileges stripped. In some places, guilds were outright banned. Guilds tried to adapt. Some merged, some modernized, some begged for royal favours. But the tide was against them. By the 18th century, in many cities, guilds had become ceremonial fossils. They still held festivals, wore robes, and gave speeches. But the real economic power had shifted elsewhere. What had started as a revolutionary force for order and quality had over time become what it once opposed, a barrier to progress. Still, their legacy didn't vanish. It simply changed shape and set the stage for what came next. Though the medieval guilds faded from power, their fingerprints are still all over modern society, if you know where to look. That trade school down the street? That's a direct descendant of the guild's apprentice system. The idea that you must train under someone skilled before being certified. That's guild logic. Even the word masterpiece still echoes its original use, a test of craftsmanship to prove your worth. Unions? Guilds were their ancestors, the OG labour protectors. They organised strikes, demanded fair wages, provided injury support, and resisted exploitation long before Marx wrote a single word. And while modern unions may be less ceremonial and slightly less obsessed with St. Crispin, their goals remain shockingly familiar: dignity, stability, and protection for the working class. But guilds also shaped our ideas about professionalism. The notion that a trade isn't just a job, but a calling, something worthy of pride, standards, and community. That's guild thinking. The plumber with certifications, the electrician with a license, the architect with a professional board. They're all walking in the footsteps of medieval masons and carpenters. Even business culture owes them a debt. Corporations and LLCs? Medieval guilds had charters, regulations, membership tiers, and communal resources. Their meeting halls looked suspiciously like today's boardrooms, except with more candles and fewer spreadsheets. Guilds also left a deep cultural mark. Towns still celebrate them through street names, coats of arms, and historic festivals. Some modern livery companies in London, like the Worshipful Company of Goldsmiths, still operate today, holding on to ancient traditions in a world run by algorithms. And perhaps most importantly, guilds gave medieval workers identity. In a brutal world of warlords, famine, and plague, being a guild member meant you had a place. You mattered. You were part of something bigger than yourself. Of course, guilds weren't perfect. They hoarded power, excluded outsiders, and often stifled innovation. But in a chaotic, unregulated world, they carved out stability and structure where there had been none. They didn't just shape trades, they shaped towns, lives, and futures. So next time you walk down a street called Butcher's Row, or see a sign for a master carpenter, remember, you're seeing the shadows of a system that, for better or worse, built the very idea of work as we know it. In the medieval world, life was shaped by the church calendar, and the church had a strict rhythm: repent, fast, then feast like your life depended on it. And after weeks, sometimes months, of going without butter, meat, or even joy itself, when the fast ended, the feasting didn't just begin, it erupted. Religious holidays were the designated times when people could let loose, legally and spiritually. From the highest lord to the lowest ploughman, there was a shared understanding. God was watching, and today he was fine with second helpings. These weren't casual meals. They were full-blown communal events with roasted meats, trenchers piled high, and pitchers of ale and spiced wine passed down long candle-lit tables. The feasts blurred the lines between religious observance and good old-fashioned revelry. People went to Mass in the morning, then to the manor hall or town square in the afternoon to eat, drink, and often dance until they couldn't see straight. Why such excess? Because it was the reward. Take Lent, for example, 40 days of fasting before Easter. No meat, no dairy, no eggs, and in some especially pious corners of Europe, no laughter. So when Easter Sunday finally arrived, it wasn't just a celebration of resurrection. It was a mass jailbreak from culinary purgatory. Even monasteries, the very symbols of discipline, weren't immune. On feast days, monks would lay out fine breads, fish stews, fruit pies, and yes, even wine. They followed the rules, sure, but they also found creative ways to define what fasting really meant. Spoiler, beaver tails counted as fish. These holiday feasts were social glue. Neighbours sat elbow to elbow. Rich and poor mingled, though not exactly equally. Lords hosted massive banquets to show off their wealth and piety. They'd invite tenants and clergy, offering symbolic generosity, while still sitting at a much nicer table. For townsfolk, it was a break from toil and a chance to eat things they usually couldn't afford. A roasted goose, a spiced pudding, maybe even something absurd like peacock served with its feathers reattached for drama. When the fast ended, The feast was a kind of rebirth, not just of the soul, but of the senses, and in the cold, muddy world of medieval life, that was reason enough to celebrate. In the darkest part of the year, when the sun barely crept above the horizon and snow turned every village into a frozen sketch, people needed something to look forward to. That something was Yule, the winter feast that blended pagan survival instincts with Christian celebration. Before Christianity reached northern Europe, Germanic and Norse peoples had already been celebrating Yule as a midwinter solstice festival. It was a time to honour the return of the sun, banish evil spirits, and roast just about anything that had the misfortune of being edible. Fires were lit to drive away darkness, and entire trees, Yule logs, were burned in hearths, meant to last 12 nights straight. The church, sensing an opportunity, didn't ban Yule. It baptised it. By the Middle Ages, Yule had become Christmastide, the 12 days of Christmas, starting on December 25th and ending with Epiphany on January 6th. But the festive spirit remained very, very pagan. The centrepiece of the Yule feast? The boar's head, roasted, garnished with herbs and fruit, and presented with a theatrical procession. In noble halls it was brought in on silver platters to the sound of music and Latin verse. For peasants, a boar was rarer, but pigs, much more likely. Every part was used. Nothing went to waste, not even the blood. Tables groaned with trenchers of bread topped with roasted game, pies stuffed with spiced fruit and meat, pottages thick with root vegetables, and puddings boiled in cloth sacks. Mead, ale, and mulled wine flowed freely, warming bellies against the cold. Yule was also a time of merriment and mischief. Mummers, travelling players, performed comedic plays and parodies, often mocking authority or retelling biblical stories with suspiciously local accents. Lords allowed jesters to poke fun at them, and even the church tolerated a bit of irreverence. In some places, the Feast of Fools allowed lower clergy to don costumes and stage mock ceremonies. It was absurd. It was chaotic. It was sanctioned. Gifts were exchanged, carols were sung, and homes were decorated with holly, ivy, and evergreens, symbols of life in the dead of winter. Yule wasn't just a feast. It was survival dressed as celebration. In the bleak heart of winter, it reminded people that life, light, and laughter still had a place at the table. If Christmas was the feast of joy, Epiphany was the feast of meaning. Celebrated on January 6th, Epiphany marked the visit of the Magi, the wise men, to the Christ child. But in the medieval world, it was also the culmination of the entire Yule season, and in many places, it was even more elaborate than Christmas Day itself. By the 12th night, people were tired, full, and possibly still drunk from a week of non-stop revelry. But no one missed Epiphany. It was the last legal excuse to eat, drink, and wear crowns before the return to daily misery. At the centre of the celebration was the king's cake, a spiced bread or pastry, often filled with nuts, dried fruit, honey, and sometimes heavily laced with wine or ale. But the twist? Hidden inside was a small object, a dried bean, a pea, or even a coin. Whoever found it became the Lord of Misrule, the king, or queen, of the feast. Now, imagine a table full of tired nobles and villagers, chewing nervously, hoping not to break a tooth, but also secretly praying to find that hidden token. If you did, you wore a paper crown, drank more than anyone else, and gave outrageous commands for the rest of the day, which everyone was honour-bound to obey, at least until the ale ran out. The church tried to keep Epiphany solemn. After all, it was about divine revelation, Christ revealed to the Gentiles. But in practice, it was absurd, theatrical, and full of role reversals. Servants mocked their masters. Women gave orders to men. Monks impersonated bishops. In France and England, children were crowned boy bishops, who led processions and mock sermons. It was chaos, structured, holy chaos. Feasting was still very much involved. Tables were reset with the best of what remained, roasted meats, candied nuts, sweet custards, and mulled wines. In richer households, exotic spices like cinnamon, cloves, and saffron made appearances, signalling wealth and worldliness. Epiphany was a strange blend of solemnity and satire. A sacred day laced with sugar, sarcasm, and symbolism. It reminded medieval people that even in the most rigid social order, there was space, however briefly, for play, inversion, and mystery. After Epiphany, the long winter resumed. But for one last, glittering night, the world turned upside down, and everyone played along. If medieval feasts were fire, Lent was the ice bucket. Lasting 40 days, not counting Sundays, Lent was the season of discipline, denial, and spiritual grit, leading up to the great triumph of Easter. But in practical terms, it was a long, exhausting culinary drought that made Easter taste like heaven. Lent officially began on Ash Wednesday, following the riotous indulgence of Shrovetide, a pre-fast spree where people cleared out their pantries in one last glorious binge of butter, eggs, and meat. It was the medieval version of eat everything before the diet starts. Pancakes, pastries, sausages, anything rich or fatty had to go. Then the fun stopped. During Lent, meat was strictly forbidden. Dairy, eggs, and even certain fats were also off limits, depending on the region and level of devotion. That meant no milk in your porridge, no cheese with your bread, no lard for your vegetables. It was a diet built around fish, legumes, onions, leeks, and penance. Monasteries had rule books to guide this austerity. Lay people followed the example, sort of. While some genuinely suffered through Lent with humility, others learned to improvise. In medieval France, beaver tails were classified as fish, and thus fair game for fasting. In some places, barnacle geese, mysterious birds that supposedly grew on driftwood, were also eaten, since they were considered half fish, half bird. Science? No. But spiritual loopholes? Absolutely. But for most people, Lent was hard. Especially the poor, who had no salted meat or luxury items to give up in the first place. They just got hungrier. Children grew listless, energy drained from fields and workshops, and the world seemed grey, physically and spiritually. And that's precisely why the Easter feast mattered so much. The more intense the fast, the more glorious the reward. Lent wasn't just a theological ritual. It was a psychological setup for the most joyous meal of the year. The deprivation carved out space for the celebration. By Holy Saturday, kitchens came alive. Ovens were stoked, butter churned, eggs, hoarded or newly laid, were whisked into custards. Lambs were prepared, sweetbread spiced, wine uncorked. The long hunger would end soon, and what followed wasn't just a feast. It was an explosion of colour, taste, music, and resurrection. After 40 days of grey skies, grey food, and grey moods, Easter arrived like a thunderclap of joy. It was the holiest feast of the Christian calendar, a celebration of Christ's resurrection, yes, but also a visceral explosion of colour, music, and culinary indulgence. This was not a simple meal. It was redemption on a plate. The feast began after the Easter Vigil, a long late-night church service on Holy Saturday. People gathered with candles, sang hymns, and waited for the return of the light, both literally and spiritually. When the bells finally rang and Christ is risen was proclaimed, the entire town seemed to exhale. At last, the fast was over. The feast could begin. And what a feast it was. Roast lamb was the centrepiece, both symbolic and delicious. It represented the Lamb of God, of course, but also the return of meat after 6 weeks of staring longingly at fish stew. Wealthier households might also serve ham, veal, or even a whole suckling pig, apples in its mouth and all. For those who couldn't afford meat, they made do with eggs, cheese, and breads enriched with butter, luxuries that had been forbidden just days before. Eggs were everywhere, boiled, dyed, baked into pies, or hidden inside sweet custards. They symbolised new life and resurrection, but let's be honest, People had just been hoarding them for weeks, because chickens don't stop laying during Lent. Come Easter, the backlog became bounty. There were breads braided with herbs, honey cakes topped with dried fruit, and spiced wine poured liberally. Vegetables returned to the table, often roasted in animal fat for that rich, forbidden flavour. In towns with Jewish populations, some elements of Passover feasting even made their way into Easter meals: bitter herbs, flatbreads, and storytelling. The atmosphere: joyful chaos. Musicians played, children shouted and played egg-rolling games. Nobles handed out coins and sweet buns to the poor as acts of public piety. Monks prepared elaborate tableaux of the resurrection, complete with costumes, chanting, and stage effects involving smoke and bells. Easter wasn't just a religious observance, it was a rebirth of the senses, a cosmic party after a long spiritual drought. And in a medieval world full of war, plague, and hunger, that kind of joy was not just welcome, it was sacred. When we think of the medieval church, we tend to picture monks in silence, stern priests wagging fingers, and rules, lots of rules. But here's the twist. The church wasn't just the moral referee of the medieval feast scene. It was often the host, chef, and party planner. Feasting and faith went hand in hand, especially on holy days. The church calendar didn't just mark fasting periods, it also dictated feasting ones. Nearly every major celebration had a liturgical justification and a table groaning with food. Saints' days, holy days, martyrdoms, miracles, all worthy of a good meal. Monasteries, for example, weren't just quiet enclaves of prayer. They were food powerhouses. Many owned vast tracts of farmland, vineyards, breweries, and fisheries. Their kitchens could rival noble households in size and output. On feast days, they'd roll out courses of baked fish, fresh bread, soft cheese, fruit conserves, and if the day was really special, sugar. The white gold of the medieval world. For bishops and abbots, lavish hospitality was practically expected. It showed piety, generosity, and power. Hosting a proper Easter or Epiphany banquet, complete with clergy, nobles, and poor villagers, was as much a religious act as saying Mass. It was charity wrapped in pastry. Even lower clergy participated. Parish priests would often hold feasts for their congregations, blessing the food and wine before joining in. Sometimes the churchyard itself became a festival ground, filled with music, dancing, and tables set under the open sky. Sermons in the morning, cider by sundown. Of course, there were critics. Some reformers grumbled that monks were becoming too soft, too fond of roast goose and strong ale. There were complaints about gluttony in the name of God, especially when abbots had private dining rooms with velvet cushions and silver cutlery. But for the most part, the church defended these feasts as expressions of divine joy. Spiritual celebrations made material. Feasting wasn't just tolerated by the church, it was theology you could taste. Bread wasn't just food, it was sacrament. Wine wasn't just drink, it was celebration. And joy, after all, was one of the fruits of the spirit. In medieval Europe, to feast was not just human, it was holy. Medieval feasts weren't just about food, they were full-blown sensory spectacles. If you were invited to a holiday banquet, you weren't just coming to eat, you were stepping into a carefully staged performance, where roasted boars shared the spotlight with jesters, musicians, mimes, dancers, and the occasional fire breather. Let's start with the basics: music and dancing. Minstrels were as essential to a feast as the meat. They played lutes, flutes, drums, and bagpipes, weaving in songs about saints, battles, courtly love, or just mildly offensive peasant humour. After enough wine, everyone, from knights to cooks, might join in singing bawdy songs or stomping in impromptu reels around the hall. Then came the mummers, travelling players who performed masked plays known for their absurdity and irreverence. Mumming was part theatre, part ritual, part fever dream. Actors wore animal masks, dressed as kings or angels, and told tales with heavy doses of slapstick and satire. Saints' lives were reimagined with local accents, devils were played for laughs, and biblical scenes got suspiciously personal. The Feast of Fools, in particular, leaned hard into this, turning the world upside down with mock sermons and role reversals. And of course, there was tableside entertainment. Ever seen a meat pie that, when sliced, released a flock of live birds? Medieval diners did. It wasn't uncommon for dishes to double as stage props, pastries shaped like castles, sugar sculptures of dragons, even roasted swans redressed in their feathers. These were culinary stunts designed to make jaws drop. Rich lords might hire acrobats or animal trainers, even dwarfs or jesters, to perform tricks between courses. The point wasn't subtlety, it was spectacle. The feast was theatre, and every guest had a front row seat. Even the food told stories. Symbolic dishes represented religious ideas, fish shaped like crosses, loaves baked with hidden icons, coloured sauces aligned with liturgical meanings. Nothing was accidental. Everything, from the plate to the performance, reinforced the sacred and the spectacular. To eat at a medieval holiday feast was to be inside the story, singing, laughing, gasping at fireballs or edible castles. In a world with no Netflix, this was the blockbuster premiere, and it came with pudding. Not all medieval feasts were created equal. While the holiday calendar was shared by everyone, peasant, priest, and king, what actually landed on your plate varied wildly depending on your status. In theory, everyone was celebrating the same holy day. In practice, you might be chewing on cabbage stew while the nobility dined on roasted peacock. Let's start at the bottom, the peasantry. Holiday feasts were a rare break from monotony and hunger. Most of the year, meals were built around grain, porridge, coarse bread, and whatever seasonal vegetables survived the cellar. But on major feasts like Easter or Epiphany, even the poorest households scraped together something special. A chicken might be slaughtered. Butter, hoarded for weeks, could be churned and slathered on fresh bread. Simple pies were filled with apples or onions. Ale flowed a little freer. And if a local lord was feeling generous, he might host a public feast in the village square, offering roasted meat, soup, or sweet buns to the masses, partly out of piety, partly out of political optics. In towns, the emerging middle class of merchants and artisans feasted with more flair. They had access to better ingredients, imported spices, and bigger ovens. Their holiday tables might include dried fruits, honey cakes, sausages, meat pies, and cheese aged in cellars under cobbled streets. Guilds often organised communal feasts, reinforcing both brotherhood and social order. It was a display of civic pride and financial success. But then there were the nobles, for whom feasting was performance art. A royal Christmas or Easter banquet wasn't just a meal, it was a message. Roasted boars with apples in their mouths, towers of marzipan, fish dyed gold, pastries shaped like animals, castles, even saints. Each course arrived with music, fanfare, and sometimes a line of servants bearing flaming torches. Their ingredients came from far and wide: cinnamon from Ceylon, sugar from Venice, oranges from Spain. Dishes were elaborate, excessive, and meant to impress. And unlike the peasants, nobles dined on white bread, fine wine, and meats forbidden to others during fasting periods, all thanks to special permissions or medical reasons. So yes, everyone feasted, but your place at the table, and what was on it, said everything about who you were in the world. Long after the last boar's head was served, long after the mummers stopped performing, and the church bells rang out their final holiday hymns, the memory of medieval holiday feasts lingered, in hearts, in recipes, and in rituals that still echo today. For medieval people, these feasts weren't just indulgent distractions. They were anchors of identity, marking the passing of time and tying the sacred to the communal. In a world of plagues, bad harvests, and political upheaval, the annual rhythm of Yule, Epiphany, and Easter offered reassurance that joy still returned, that light followed darkness, that the fast always gave way to the feast. Even as the centuries rolled on and the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance, then to modernity, many of the core traditions survived. Christmas as we know it, the roasted meats, the Yule log, the gift-giving, the decorated greenery, all have roots in medieval customs. So do king's cakes, now enjoyed in places like France, Spain and New Orleans during Epiphany, and Mardi Gras, still hiding a tiny token inside for a lucky reveller. Easter too kept its flavour. Eggs, once symbols of resurrection and rationed treasure, remain centerpieces. Easter lamb, whether real or symbolic in chocolate form, continues to grace modern tables. Even hot cross buns, traced to ancient Lenten customs, still show up every spring in supermarkets and bakeries. But perhaps more lasting than the food itself is the idea of feasting as sacred. The belief that certain days are meant to be set apart, for gathering, for gratitude, for remembering that joy too is holy, is a medieval inheritance. Holiday feasts weren't just about gluttony, they were acts of hope, defiance even. A community saying, we are still here, we still believe, we still celebrate. In an age before refrigeration, industrial ovens, or supermarkets, pulling off a holiday feast took planning, sacrifice, and imagination. It required whole communities working together, baking, roasting, singing, praying. And the payoff was never just a full stomach. It was laughter, storytelling, shared humanity. A brief taste of heaven. In the grand halls of imperial Rome, where marble gleamed and whispers travelled faster than horses, Faustina the Younger entered the world in 130 CE. She was not born into ordinary nobility, she was born into the pinnacle of Roman prestige. Her father was Antoninus Pius, a man destined to become emperor. Her mother, Faustina the Elder, was already an icon of Roman matronly virtue. Faustina the Younger didn't just inherit wealth or a name, she inherited expectation. Raised in the elite imperial court, Faustina grew up surrounded by statues of gods, guarded by senators, and tutored by some of the sharpest minds in the empire. She learned Latin and Greek before most Roman girls learned how to weave. Her education wasn't ornamental, it was political. She was trained in stoic thought, in the art of rhetoric, and in the careful performance of virtue. Her childhood was a dress rehearsal for empresshood, but behind the polished bronze and public rituals, Roman imperial life was a tightrope walk. Faustina was not just her parents' daughter, she was a piece on the board, a tool to reinforce dynastic succession and public trust in the Antonine family. From the moment she could walk, every gesture was part of a wider play. Her smile was diplomacy, her silence, calculation. And yet, even in this rigidly controlled environment, Faustina showed signs of strength. She was known for her poise, her presence, and later, her charisma, traits that would serve her well in a world dominated by political intrigue and fragile male egos. Her lineage set her apart. She was the great-niece of Hadrian, future wife of Marcus Aurelius, and mother to the infamous Commodus. Even before her marriage, her destiny was set in stone, literally. Busts of her mother lined temples, coins bore her name, and poets praised her bloodline as divine. But greatness is a double-edged sword. The same fame that elevated Faustina also placed her under constant scrutiny. Whispers would follow her for the rest of her life, some adoring, others scandalous. From the beginning, she wasn't just a Roman woman. She was a symbol, and in Rome, symbols had to shine, or be shattered. In 145 CE, at just 15 years old, Faustina the Younger married her cousin, a quiet, serious philosopher named Marcus Aurelius. It was a political union, carefully arranged to solidify dynastic continuity, but surprisingly, it became something else entirely, a true partnership, unusual for an imperial marriage. Marcus was not yet emperor, but everyone knew it was coming. He was Hadrian's chosen heir through adoption, groomed from youth in the ways of Stoic philosophy. Faustina, for her part, was not just a decorative bride. She was already groomed for the throne, raised with the bearing of an empress. Together, they became the golden couple of the Antonine dynasty. And yet, this was no fairy tale. The Roman world was filled with civil unrest, border wars, and plagues. Being empress wasn't about silk and feasts. It was about representing strength, producing heirs, and keeping the imperial image spotless, all while navigating a court full of whispers and daggers. Faustina rose to the challenge. She embraced the role of Augusta, the empress consort, with conviction. Statues of her were erected across the empire. Coins were minted with her image beside Marcus, signalling her central role in Rome's stability. She didn't just stand beside the throne, she shared its weight. She also took on the traditional role of mother of the empire, quite literally. Over the course of her marriage, Faustina gave birth to at least 14 children, though only a few survived infancy. Among them was Commodus, a boy who would later rule, and nearly ruin, the Roman Empire. Despite the loss and political stress, Marcus adored her. His meditations, that quiet personal work of stoic reflection, occasionally hint at a man deeply grateful for his wife's strength and loyalty. He called her faithful and praised her virtues, even as gossip about her swirled in Roman salons and barracks. Because for all her dignity, rumours clung to Faustina like perfume. Stories of affairs, political manipulation, and wild behaviour would dog her for decades. Some exaggerated, some invented by enemies, some perhaps uncomfortably close to truth. But whatever the truth, Faustina was no passive ornament. She was a force beside the throne, elegant, effective, and already controversial. And her real influence was just beginning. To be a Roman empress was to be a mother, not just to children, but to the empire itself. For Faustina the Younger, this was not symbolic. She was quite literally the womb of dynastic survival. Over the course of her marriage to Marcus Aurelius, Faustina gave birth to an astounding 14 children. It was both a political necessity and a personal ordeal. Every successful birth meant another potential heir, another safeguard for Rome's future. But the grim reality of Roman medicine meant that most of her children died young. Only a handful survived to adulthood. Each loss was a private grief, made public through shrines, mourning rituals, and silent imperial processions. The most infamous of her surviving children was Lucius Aurelius Commodus, born in 161 CE. He would later become emperor, and, as many historians argue, one of the worst in Roman history. But as a child, he was Rome's hope. Faustina poured herself into shaping him, overseeing his upbringing in the imperial household, where education was administered by philosophers and slaves alike. Yet Faustina was more than just a mother in the biological sense. She became a maternal figure for the Roman people, especially the soldiers. She often travelled with Marcus during military campaigns, a rare move for an empress, bringing her children along and living among the troops. To the soldiers, she was not a distant goddess in ivory towers. She was there, visible, regal, and present in moments of both triumph and fear. In return, the army adored her. She was called Mater Castrorum, Mother of the Camp. It was a title no other empress had borne before her. It wasn't ceremonial. It was earned. And it mattered. Roman soldiers were notoriously difficult to impress, yet Faustina's presence calmed camps and inspired loyalty. Her symbolic power reinforced Marcus Aurelius's own authority. Together, they were not just emperor and empress, they were the parents of Rome. But with influence came resentment. Not everyone believed a woman should hold such sway over public morale and imperial policy. Behind the scenes, whispers about her grew louder. Was she truly loyal? Was she too powerful? Was she hiding something? One thing was clear. Faustina was no silent matron. She was a mother, yes, but she was also a player in the imperial game. In a world where Roman imperial marriages were more about alliances than affection, the union between Faustina the Younger and Marcus Aurelius stood out, not for its ceremony, but for its intimacy. On paper, it was textbook dynastic strategy. Faustina, daughter of Antoninus Pius, married to Marcus, his adopted son and heir. The marriage solidified the succession, created a united front, and reassured Rome that the throne would remain within a respected bloodline. But what developed between them was, by many accounts, a genuine bond. Marcus Aurelius, the famously stoic philosopher-emperor, rarely spoke emotionally, except when it came to Faustina. In his Meditations, a deeply private text never meant for publication, he wrote of her as his most faithful and beloved wife. In a world of arranged unions and interchangeable empresses, that line spoke volumes. Their partnership was political, yes, but also collaborative. Faustina travelled with Marcus on campaign. She supported his decisions, even in the brutal chaos of frontier warfare. In return, Marcus honoured her publicly. He granted her unprecedented titles, minted coins bearing her face, and involved her in key ceremonial roles. She wasn't just an accessory to power, she was half of the equation. And yet, the Roman public was divided. To the military, she was a beloved presence. To the Senate and aristocracy, she was a more complicated figure. Rumours trailed her like perfume. Some claimed she had lovers among the gladiators. Others whispered of political manipulation, emotional instability, even conspiracy. There was no concrete proof, only shadows and hearsay. But the Roman elite was never one to let facts get in the way of a juicy scandal. What's remarkable is that Marcus never wavered. While other emperors might have exiled or quietly replaced a troublesome wife, Marcus remained loyal. Either he didn't believe the rumours, or he didn't care. Their marriage lasted 30 years, through war, plague, rebellion, and immense personal loss. And while historians still debate whether the loyalty was mutual, the emperor's devotion was undeniable. In the end, theirs was a marriage everyone watched, half scandal, half legend, entirely unforgettable. But as the empire descended into chaos, even the strongest unions would face breaking points. For all her titles, triumphs, and imperial honours, Faustina the Younger was never free from the long shadow of scandal. From the palaces of Rome to the far-flung provinces, her name stirred admiration, suspicion, and sometimes thinly veiled disgust. The Roman elite whispered that Faustina was unfaithful, impulsive, and dangerously ambitious. The most infamous rumour? That her son, Commodus, was not the child of Marcus Aurelius, but the product of an affair with a gladiator. It was a story fit for the amphitheatre, the empress, descending from her marble pedestal to consort with the bloodied champions of the arena. Scandalous? Absolutely. True? Almost certainly not. Yet the story persisted, not because of evidence, but because it fit the narrative the Senate wanted to believe. They despised Commodus and needed someone to blame for his erratic, cruel reign. Faustina, already dead when Commodus took power, made a convenient scapegoat. There were other stories too, tales of political scheming, of manipulating Marcus behind the scenes, of playing favourites at court. Critics painted her as a Roman Helen of Troy, a woman whose beauty and influence could sway the empire's fate. And like most powerful women in ancient history, that mix of visibility and authority became a magnet for slander. It didn't help that Faustina often travelled with the military, a realm traditionally reserved for men. Her presence in the camps, while celebrated by the soldiers, was seen by some senators as improper. What kind of empress sleeps under canvas, dines with centurions, whispers orders outside the forum? Even her charity work, her sponsorship of orphanages and support for the poor, was twisted into political theatre by her detractors. Was she truly generous, they asked, or simply buying love to offset her personal reputation? Through all of it, Marcus Aurelius never flinched. He continued to refer to her as loyal, honoured her with statues, and praised her memory after her death. Either he was blind to her faults, or he knew the rumours were just that, rumours. In truth, the scandal says more about Rome than about Faustina. A powerful woman who defied quiet expectations was bound to attract enemies. And Faustina, for better or worse, never played small. It was highly unusual, almost unthinkable, for a Roman empress to follow the legions into battle. But Faustina the Younger did exactly that. In 161 CE, Marcus Aurelius inherited an empire in crisis. From the Parthian frontier in the east to the unruly Danube in the north, Rome's borders were aflame. Civil unrest, disease, and foreign invasions turned what might have been a philosopher's reign into a soldier's grind. And through it all, Faustina travelled with him. She didn't just make ceremonial appearances. Faustina lived among the troops, enduring the same cold, mud, and tension as any officer. She visited camps, oversaw supply distributions, and tended to the morale of soldiers. To the men, she wasn't just a distant goddess on coins. She was there, in person, bearing the hardships of war with imperial grace. It was during these campaigns, especially along the Danube during the Marcomannic Wars, that Faustina earned her most famous title, Mater Castrorum, or Mother of the Camp. It was more than a flattering nickname. It was a formal recognition of her presence, leadership, and connection with the legions. This was revolutionary. No previous empress had ever received such a title. It cemented her role not just as Marcus's wife, but as an emblem of unity for the soldiers. While emperors ruled by command, Faustina ruled by presence, and the loyalty she inspired in the military made her all the more threatening to her critics in Rome. The optics were powerful. An empress in armour-trimmed robes, standing beside the philosopher king in war councils, sharing meals with officers, praying at local altars for victory. She blurred the lines between ceremonial and strategic, and the empire took notice. Of course, traditionalists were horrified. The Senate, steeped in patriarchal values, muttered that her influence was unnatural. A woman in the barracks? They scoffed. But for the common soldier, and for many in the provinces, she became a symbol of hope. An empress who did not retreat into marble halls, but stood with Rome on the frontier. Faustina's time on campaign wasn't a footnote. It was a defining chapter in her legacy. While others judged from afar, she walked among soldiers, not afraid to share the mud, the blood, and the burden of empire. In 175 CE, Faustina the Younger died suddenly in the remote town of Halala, in the mountains of Cappadocia, far from Rome and far from peace. She had followed Marcus Aurelius deep into the empire's turbulent eastern frontier, once again travelling with the military during a time of chaos. She was only around 45 years old. Her death came shortly after a major crisis, the rebellion of Avidius Cassius, a Roman general who falsely declared himself emperor under the mistaken belief that Marcus had died. The coup failed, but it shook the empire, and it may have broken Faustina's spirit. Some sources even suggest she had backed Cassius in secret, though this was likely a slander invented by her enemies after the fact. Whatever the truth, her death devastated Marcus. He was far from stoic in mourning. His grief was public, lavish, and immediate. Marcus ordered the Senate to deify her, and they complied. Faustina the Younger became a goddess. Her name joined the ranks of the divine, alongside emperors and empresses before her. She was no longer just Augusta, she was Diva Faustina. And with deification came monuments. The town of Halala, where she died, was renamed Faustinopolis in her honour. Temples were erected, statues sculpted, and coins minted bearing her divine image, now wreathed in stars. In Rome, the temple of Faustina and Marcus Aurelius rose, anchoring her memory to the forum itself. More than just ritual, her deification was a political act. It reminded the empire of her virtues, sanitized her reputation, and reinforced the legitimacy of Marcus and their son, Commodus. A divine mother meant a divinely appointed heir, even if that heir would turn out to be deeply flawed. Interestingly, her apotheosis did not erase the rumours. Whispered tales of betrayal, ambition, and scandal still clung to her legacy. But as with all Roman deities, worship didn't require moral perfection, only symbolism and memory. In death, Faustina became eternal, not just in the temples, but in the Roman imagination. She had lived in shadow and light, loved fiercely, ruled boldly, and died far from home. And Rome, for all its suspicion, couldn't help but build her a pedestal that reached the heavens. When Marcus Aurelius died in 180 CE, he left the Roman Empire in the hands of a young man who would become one of its most infamous rulers, Lucius Aurelius Commodus, the son of Faustina the Younger. For a brief moment, it seemed like the dynasty Faustina had helped build would endure. Commodus was the first emperor in nearly a century to be born into power, not adopted into it. His succession marked a turning point, and a gamble. But within a few short years it became clear. Commodus was no Marcus Aurelius. His reign was marked by paranoia, cruelty, self-indulgence, and spectacle. He fancied himself Hercules reborn, fought in the gladiatorial arena, renamed Rome after himself, and left the administration to a rotating cast of sycophants and assassins. And inevitably, the question arose. Was Faustina to blame? Ancient historians, always eager to moralize, looked backward through Commodus's madness and found, conveniently, his mother. They dredged up every rumor, every whisper of infidelity, every accusation of scheming, and painted Faustina as the true seed of the empire's corruption. If Commodus was a monster, surely his mother had either birthed it or moulded it. But this is more political narrative than fact. Faustina died when Commodus was just a teenager. By all accounts, she had played a central role in his early education and upbringing, surrounding him with tutors, philosophers, and statesmen. She travelled with him on campaign, helped prepare him for imperial life, and oversaw his introduction to Roman politics. But no mother, divine or mortal, could completely control the future, not in a world as unstable and brutal as Rome. Some historians today suggest that Faustina's early death may have removed the only person who could have grounded Commodus. Without her presence, he was left under the influence of corrupt courtiers and opportunistic handlers. Marcus, exhausted and grieving, may have failed to recognize how far his son was drifting. Still, her legacy was now tied to Commodus's shadow. Her deification remained untouched, but her memory became complicated. A tragic symbol of how even the best-laid dynastic plans can unravel. She had birthed a god. She had buried children, and she had given Rome an emperor it would never forget, for all the wrong reasons. Faustina the Younger died nearly 2,000 years ago, yet her story still flickers in marble statues, coin portraits, and the brittle pages of ancient histories. Her legacy is a mosaic of contradictions, empress and scandal, mother and manipulator, goddess and mortal woman. In her lifetime, she was one of the most powerful women in Roman history. She advised emperors, influenced troops, bore heirs, and stood on the edges of battlefields, actions that would terrify any traditional Roman senator. And because of that power, she became a lightning rod for gossip and myth. She was remembered by the military as Mater Castrorum, the empress who stood with them in the mud and snow. By her husband Marcus Aurelius, she was remembered as his faithful and beloved partner. But to historians like Cassius Dio and the ever-scandal-loving gossip mills of late antiquity, she became the empress of rumours, blamed for infidelities, conspiracies, and even the rise of Commodus. Her statues, of which dozens survive, show a serene woman with carefully arranged curls and eyes turned to the heavens. But beneath that idealized gaze lies a story rarely told. A woman raised inside imperial machinery, trained to perform perfection, yet forced to navigate a brutal, male-dominated empire that rarely forgave influence, especially when it came from a woman. Her deification after death was not merely honorific. It was strategic. In a time when dynasties were fragile and emperors frequently fell to poison or blade, immortalizing Faustina served as a stabilizing myth. A divine mother meant a divine lineage. Her temples, coins, and titles helped soothe an empire unsure of Commodus and nostalgic for Marcus's reign. But even today, historians remain divided. Was Faustina a model empress who upheld duty in the face of war and grief, or a savvy political player who cloaked ambition in maternal virtue? Perhaps both. Perhaps that's what makes her unforgettable. She lived in a world of shadows and spectacles, where women could rule only if they wore a mask. Faustina wore many: goddess, wife, mother, seductress, soldier's muse. But behind the bronze and legend was a human being, navigating power, loss, and love, in the heart of the most dangerous empire in the world.